I never imagined the people I raised would choose clean bank statements over me while still expecting me to patch up the mess they made. I stood in my kitchen with the smell of burnt coffee clinging to the air and a folded piece of paper in my hand and felt something inside me change. My name is Ruth Carter. I am 61 years old. Until that dinner, I thought family meant shelter, meant a shared table where loyalties were not measured in dollars. Stay with me because this is not a story about loud revenge. It is a story about quiet proof, about learning the language of money and law, about turning a hidden fact into a new kind of security. Comment where you are watching from and listen until the end because the part that comes after the revelations is the one they never expected. It all started with a routine evening and ended with me buying more than a building. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other by the sound of their footsteps and the color of their curtains. My childhood smelled of lemon oil and wool blankets, of radio static on cold mornings, and the creak of the porch swing. My father taught me to fix a fence and how to balance a checkbook before I could drive. In my 20s, I married a man named Edward, whose laugh filled rooms and whose hands smelled of oil and tobacco. He taught me patience and how to steer a room back toward calm. We saved quietly, paid every bill on time, and made a house a home. When he died 12 years ago, the cost of grief was not just sorrow. It was paperwork and a quiet reallocation of roles. My daughter Sarah promised to help. My son-in-law Mark promised support. I believed them. For years, I kept the little leather-bound ledger Edward left behind tucked under my pillow like a relic. It contained notes about accounts, a list of names, the phrase trust deferred that I never fully understood, and a scrawl referencing an estate lawyer named Paul Warren. After Edward's death, I worked part-time at the library, mended sweaters, and became the person neighbors called when they needed a casserole. I never thought those small acts of care would become an invoice in my family's eyes. That ledger was more than paper. It was a breadcrumb trail to things nobody had told me existed and a map to a quiet power I did not know I had. The inciting moment happened at their house on a Thursday night, the kind of ordinary night that masks decisions that look like accidents. The dining room light buzzed low. The scent of roasted vegetables and a cheap white wine filled the room. Sarah set down a plate and did not look at me when she spoke. "Mom, we cannot keep repeating the same story," she said. "You cannot just live here and expect us to carry the cost." "I thought I was family," I said, my voice small. "You are family, but you have to understand things have changed," Mark replied without meeting my eyes. "We have responsibilities, rent to pay, a mortgage on this place." "The mortgage you took on after Dad died," I said. "We talked about that." "We did not talk about supporting someone full-time who was not contributing," Sarah said, sharper now. "It is not sustainable." "I have savings. I have the ledger Edward left." "Savings are not endless," Mark cut in. "We cannot be your bank." My hands were cold. I felt the linoleum under my feet like a memory I could not step out of. "So what are you saying?" "We cannot have you here full-time," Sarah said, almost whispering. "We can offer a room for a little while until you get back on your feet." "A little while?" Mark echoed. "Ruth," said Linda, our neighbor, who had come to drop off a casserole and now stood in the doorway, "this is a hard conversation." "It is a conversation I did not start," I said. "You are choosing money, not me." "That is not what we are doing," Sarah insisted. "It is what you think we are doing," I answered. There were 10 exchanges that night, each one a small blade. By the end of the meal, I was gathering 2 suitcases into the trunk of my car while Mark held the door, as if he were presenting me with a favor. The next week smelled of motel soap and spilled vending machine coffee. My low point was not a single moment, but a texture of nights. The hum of the neon sign outside, the scratch of curtains when I pulled them closed, the metallic taste of microwave dinners eaten on a plastic tray. I slept in a room where the wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin. I sent out resumes and called temp agencies. I scraped coins from jars to pay for the room. Friends like Linda and a former colleague named Rosa brought sandwiches and kind words. But kindness does not pay deposits. I was small in a world that had suddenly gone loud. On a late night when rain fretted at the window and the air conditioner rattled like a throat clearing, I decided to sort through a box of things Edward had left in my car. There was the little leather ledger I had kept, a pile of yellowed receipts, and an envelope with the letterhead of a bank I recognized but had not thought of in years. The envelope was soft at the corners, a friction of wax and paper under my thumb. Inside was a single sheet, folded 3 times, with a lawyer's typed note referencing a trust to be activated upon certain conditions. It mentioned a name I had half remembered from newspaper clippings, Paul Warren of Warren & Klein, and it mentioned code words like discretionary distribution and account designated for surviving spouse needs. The words cut through the motel's stale air with a metallic clarity. I read it again and again, each time tasting a cautious sweet hope. I will not pretend the discovery felt like a cinematic lightning bolt. It felt like a slow thaw. The ledger, the bank envelope, and a note tucked into Edward's old wallet worked together like a key ring. I called Paul the next morning. His voice was steady and practical. "You have found something important," he said. He asked me to bring copies and to stop by his office. The office smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Paul introduced me to Elena, a forensic document expert who ran her fingers over the ledger and said quietly, "This is consistent with the handwriting he used on official notes." Elena found marginalia that suggested Edward had arranged a contingency trust for me in case certain events happened. He was cautious, she said. He protected what he could in ways he knew how. A bank manager named Nora pulled records and found an account that had been accruing interest quietly for years. Miguel, a real estate agent who knew neighborhood auctions and had once helped me with a housewarming, explained options in plain language. There were 8 named people who mattered now: Sarah, Mark, Jason their son, Linda, Rosa, Paul, Elena, and Miguel. Each of them reacted when I moved from confusion to deliberate action. Miguel leaned in and said, "There is a way to use the account to secure a property and build steady income." Paul advised forming a limited liability company to hold an asset so it would be legally separated from personal disputes. "Form an LLC," he said. "Call it Carter Holding or something formal. Keep records. Be quiet about it until you know the legal details." The idea of learning these words felt like learning a new language that belonged to another world, one that suddenly allowed me to speak as if I belonged there too. I began to educate myself the way one learns to read when illiterate is no longer an option. I sat at library computers with a hum of fluorescent lights overhead and typed LLC formation procedures, articles about probate law, and auction strategies. I met a woman named Rosa who ran the shelter and who explained the humane side of property ownership. "Buildings can become tools for safety," she said. "They can shelter people who need a chance." I set up a small plan with help from Paul and Miguel. We would use the account Edward had arranged to seed a special purpose LLC. We would bid at a municipal auction for a small apartment building that, by chance, housed a unit where Sarah and Mark rented. It was strategic and legal and silent. I learned to sign documents with a steadiness that surprised me. I learned to file articles of organization, to draft operating agreements, to calculate earnest money, to schedule an inspection. During long nights, I traced the edges of Edward's ledger, feeling ink impressions like braille that spelled out permission. I practiced a new vocabulary out loud: trust, conveyance, foreclosure auction, escrow, tenant rights. It felt absurd and right at once. The execution had the hush of a prayer and the method of a well-planned operation. On auction day, the courthouse smelled of old pages and coffee. The gavel came down with a dull authority, and I felt something like vertigo as my bidder number was announced. Miguel stood beside me and whispered logistics. Paul had arranged for an escrow deposit, and Elena had verified documents in case of challenge. The bidding was quiet, the room full of people whose faces told histories I would never know. When the opportunity came to bid on the small brick building, I raised my paddle. I imagined a dozen scenes at once: a letter arriving in a mailbox, a notice of ownership, the sense of quiet inevitability that comes when the law has been followed. I won. They registered the LLC, we transferred funds, and I sat in a car outside the courthouse with the paper in my lap and felt rain pattering like punctuation. Notices went out to tenants, including Sarah and Mark. They received the formal communication stating that the property had been acquired by Carter Holding LLC and that ownership had changed hands. The first notice felt like paper diplomacy. Within days, they reached out. Their tones were different. Mark was evasive on the phone. "We did not know you were serious," he said. "We thought you could not do this." "I am serious," I told him, serious enough to act legally and quietly. Jason, my grandson, texted a string of worried emojis. Linda called to say she had seen the letter and that it had looked official. There were 10 exchanges of messages in the week that followed as they adjusted to a reality where the person they had dismissed now had legal power. One of my 3 major tension moments came when Mark burst into the management office one afternoon demanding a meeting. He pounded a folded notice on my desk, and the sound of paper hitting wood was like a small thunderclap. "You cannot do this to us," he said, voice tight. "We raised this building, we rented you a room, and you make this move without telling us." I sat calm, the office air cool against my skin, the faint hum of the copier in the corner. "You asked me to leave," I said. "You made choices." "This is spite," he said. "You are trying to control us." I stood and walked to the window. "This is legal ownership," I said. The silence afterward was heavy as velvet. The smell of Mark's cologne, the taste of indignation, the way the light on the desk carved his features into hard geometry, all made the scene both intimate and brutal. The tension lasted days, with letters and veiled threats and a late-night voicemail that made my chest tighten. Yet the legal papers held. The tension paragraph above captures the crescendo where private anger became public process. Another crucial tension paragraph came when an anonymous envelope arrived at the LLC's registered address containing a copy of a forged signature on a maintenance contract. The paper was thick, the ink smeared, the intent clear. Someone had tried to create a pretext for legal action. I remember the paper between my fingers, the dry scratch of my nails, the metallic tang of fear at the back of my throat. I called Elena, who examined the forgery, and said quietly, "This is crude but dangerous if unchecked." We brought the evidence to Paul, who filed a declaratory action to protect the LLC and to require production of the origin of the forged documents. For a week, the house hummed with uncertainty. Emails were sent, voices rose in long conference calls, and for a while, the quiet dignity I had cultivated felt like it could be ripped away. But the forensics worked. The forgery traced back to a minor contractor with a history of sloppy bookkeeping who had panicked when the new ownership began enforcing rent. The legal remedy was precise and slow and finally effective. This sequence of discovery, threat, examination, and neutralization lengthened the conflict, but ultimately strengthened the case legally and morally. The last peak of tension was the public meeting at the Kennants Association, where Sarah stood up and accused me of betrayal with the kind of theatrical breath that used to be reserved for stage roles. The room smelled of stale coffee and paper, fans hummed overhead, and the fluorescent lights flattened every face. She spoke with a voice I recognized, the same cadence she used for family announcements. "You left us," she said. "You left me to clean up your past, and now you hold it over us." I answered in a way I had rehearsed not to wound, but to reveal. "I was left without a home and without information," I said. "I found proof Edward wanted me taken care of if things changed. I acted within the law. I offered to create safe options for tenants and to pay for necessary repairs." The room tightened. Miguel presented the maintenance schedule and receipts. Rosa from the shelter spoke about the community programs funded in part by a portion of the rental income we had pledged. Paul explained the legal chain and the protections in place for tenants. The meeting ended without a dramatic reconciliation, but with a new set of expectations. Each exchange there was like a coin dropped on a table and watched to see how it landed. The outcome was a conditional truce and an agreement on tenant rights and property improvements. The public revelation was not about shaming. It was about bringing hidden facts into light and turning them into a tool for stability. That of confrontation and documentation tightened the story into a place where dignity was not a favor to be granted, but a right asserted. As I moved into the epilogue, there were 3 parts to the closure. First, the practical resolution. I set aside a portion of the rental income for repairs and for a fund managed with transparency by Rosa and an independent board made up of tenants and community members. We replaced a leaking roof, repainted hallways, installed better lighting, and created a small community room where residents could hold meetings, job fairs, and knitting nights. I instituted a reasonable rent plan that offered gradual increases and protections against sudden displacement. We put a clause in the operating agreement preventing immediate sell-off without tenant first right of purchase in case of offers. The building became a steady resource rather than a cash extraction. Second, the relational adjustments. Sarah returned to speak with me one afternoon. We sat on a bench with the city smell of hot pavement and the green of a small park nearby. She said, "I was scared you would try to punish us." I said, "I never wanted to punish. I wanted to make sure I could stand on my own feet and also build something that matters." We set boundaries. She agreed to a plan for visitation with Jason that respected my space and dignity. Mark did not reappear much. Jason came by sometimes to help with light repairs and to teach me the basics of a smartphone, which he calls getting me on the ledger. Third, the moral closure. I donated half of a modest profit to the local shelter run by Rosa and established a small memorial fund in Edward's name for older adults who needed emergency housing. I planted a small garden in front of my new modest house that smells of basil and rosemary and a faint memory of Edward's hand on mine. I wrote my own note in a letter notebook and left it for Jason. It read, "You are worthy, even when others count you out." The ledger I once kept under my pillow is now a record preserved in a small binder at the community room where anyone can read the history and the changes we made. I am not vengeful. I am resolved. I reclaimed dignity in a way that kept people housed and accountable. If there is a single lesson, it is this. Dignity is not a favor one person extends to another. It is the right to be legally secure, to be treated fairly, and to be seen. My family chose money over me at a moment when they believed it to be the safest option. They still expected me to save them emotionally and to be the one to smooth every friction. Instead, I learned to translate grief into documents, frustration into contracts, and humiliation into a plan that created social good as well as personal safety. I am not the same. I am quieter and firmer and more fluent in the words that once felt foreign. If this story touched you, leave a comment with your city and a small note about a time you felt overlooked. Your words matter and can help others feel less alone. If you want more stories about people who navigated legal steps and quiet strategies to recover dignity, subscribe and we will bring you practical conversations with lawyers, community organizers, and people who have rebuilt. Thank you for listening to mine.